I'm Sam, an interpreter here at the Frontier Culture Museum, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our settlement farm. For a long time here at the museum, we've called this our 1740s farm, but in fact, we're in the process of changing this and talking a lot more about the 1760s. As far as why we made that change, variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's when this area really takes off as far as real settlement patterns and the production of cash crops, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later. Beyond that, it's a very interesting and dynamic period of time here in the Valley of Virginia because it's a time where this area was at war, really in the midst of the French and Indian War. So talking a little bit more broadly about the farm, this is at least our only European frontier farm here at the museum, really showing that edge of what had been settled here in the colony of Virginia in the 1760s. When you talk about this area was in large part settled by immigrants. A lot of Germans, Irish, some English, some Dutch, some Swiss, and some Swedes, all coming into this area wanting to own land, largely just because this is where land was pretty available and pretty cheap. We talk about the colony of Virginia overall. Again, this is a colony that is at war, and at war with the French, and more specifically with their Indian allies, most of which resided out in Michigan and Ohio. So the concern for the colony of Virginia is how do we separate those enemies of the state and keep them away from the good tobacco growing plantations back in eastern Virginia, which are making a lot of money for the crown. And the mentality that they have is that we're going to settle this area, the Valley of Virginia, with a lot of good Protestant farmers to do that. The difficulty is, where do you get good Protestant farmers? It just so happens that there was an increasingly large population of Germans and Irish coming more specifically into Pennsylvania, wanting to own land, but not finding a lot that was really available to them, especially financially in that area. So instead, a lot of them are being recruited to come down here into the Valley of Virginia and settle here as well. That sort of works twofold. The biggest issue for getting here was that the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are to the east of us here at the museum, those were pretty impassable. So it was difficult for Virginians to come across those mountains to this area. Much easier for people to start out up in Pennsylvania, walk down into this area from the top. Now, as early as the 1730s and 40s, what that meant was about a 6-week hike down Indian trails through the forest, what was known as the Warriors Trail or the Warriors Path, which connected the Haudenosaunee up in the Great Lakes with the Cherokee down in the Deep South. So 6 weeks of hiking down Indian trails with your family and your supplies, not a real great proposition, but it was sort of the price to be paid if you wanted to come here and get land. Now, by the 1760s, those trails have started to widen out a little bit into what would eventually become known as the Great Wagon Road, but that's something that takes really decades to do. Once you'd gotten here, you would need to find land. Usually you're going to go to somebody called a land agent for that. That's someone who's working either for the crown or the colony or an individual selling land and distributing it to new farmers. You'd have to hopefully get a good bit of land from that person. As far as acreage is concerned, we see plots as small as 25 acres and as large as several thousand, but the vast majority usually are between about 50 and 250 acres. So you'd get your land from that land agent, hopefully have a good water source on that, but more specifically, you were looking for land that had good hardwood trees. The mentality that the farmers had was, if the land is supporting good hardwood, not only does that give you a building material, but it also indicates that it's probably going to support your crops later on. So the next big difficulty, if you got land, it's covered in trees, you need to turn that forest into a farm. To do that, starting out small and working big. So you'd cut down trees close to water as best you can, open up fields, and start to plant crops. We're talking about crops here in the Valley of Virginia at first, mostly going to focus on food and really subsistence. So growing things like corn, beans, and squash and other vegetables will be pretty common. So that first few years, that's really all you're going to be focusing on growing, probably doing a good bit of hunting and fishing as well, but not anything real substantial. So you have your food, you have your water, the last thing you need is shelter. For most farmers coming into this area of Virginia, a big fancy house is sort of out of the question. First and foremost, they're not going to have the techniques and skills available to build something big. And beyond that, they're really not going to have the time. So a lot of farmers are going to resort to building something like this, our cabin. Fairly small, fairly simple, enough really just to keep the family warm and dry. So this is a log cabin construction, just taking all those trees that you cut down already, cutting those to length and cutting notches in them so you can stack them one on top of another, basically the same as kids' Lincoln logs today. So this kind of house would take 2 or 3 weeks to build. This would be your first house or sort of your starter house, probably the first 5 to 10 years here on the frontier while you're getting the farm up and running. Now, over the course of that time, you want to start to think about cash crops and actually making money off of the farm. The first cash crop that we know of in the Valley of Virginia was flax. That's what a lot of the Scots-Irish that were coming over were familiar with growing, but it never becomes a really massive cash crop in this area. In fact, the big cash crop here in the Valley of Virginia is going to be hemp. When we talk about this area, this is an area that's not really great for growing tobacco, at least in the 18th century. It was a little bit too cold, not quite humid enough, but hemp will grow very well, especially here in the mountainous areas. When we talk about the colony of Virginia overall, the colony didn't need a lot of hemp, but the British Navy did. So the British Navy, and more specifically Parliament, was putting a bounty on hemp prices, inflating the price, making it a lot more worthwhile for your average farmer to grow it. So this area started to grow it really quite massively. By 1770, Augusta County was producing about 100,000 pounds of hemp a year. Botetourt County, a little bit further away, producing about 170,000 pounds of hemp a year. So that was pretty big business, and that business really allowed for an early sort of economic boom in this area of Virginia. Take a little bit of a closer look here at our cabin. You can see that this is a very distinctly different method of construction than a lot of the other farms and buildings around the museum. When we look at a log cabin construction, this is not something that's distinctly Anglo-European in design or origin. Certainly, we think it's probably a lot more Scandinavian. Insofar as why colonists really reverted into making houses like this, it's hard to say. The easiest and most logical explanation is simply that first, logs were the most available building material, and second, this is the most rudimentary and simple method of construction. If we look closer, fairly simple. All we're really doing here is taking these logs, notching them top and bottom so that they're going to sit on top of each other pretty snugly and securely. This really isn't going anywhere. This is not something that's going to last for a very long period of time. If you come and look at our cabin today, it's been up well over a decade and it's starting to really show. So this isn't something that's long-lasting necessarily, but it's something that's quick, simple, and something just about everyone could do. When you go around the museum, one thing that a lot of people don't really consider is that most of our houses and buildings were not built by the people living in them. They were built by proper craftsmen, carpenters, and masons, people that had skills and knowledge that your average farmer certainly wouldn't have possessed. But this is something just about anyone could do, and it's not going to take a whole lot of skill, just a lot of really backbreaking labor. Same thing could be said for our shingles. A little bit more difficult in construction. These are what are called cedar shakes or shingles. These, very simply, are just split out pieces of wood. That can be somewhat problematic, as you see with our roof here. Sometimes they'll warp and twist and bend as they're exposed to the elements. But again, this is fairly quick and simple. One question we always get here at the museum is about our chimney. Did we build it wrong? Is it tipping over? And the answer is no. This is actually a frontier method of construction, sort of a bit of frontier ingenuity. Difficulty that most farmers would have run into is if you try to stack stone this high, unless you're a mason and really understand the skills and techniques required, that stone is not going to stand. It's usually going to fall over. So by building it like this, and this particular chimney, the lower level is river stone, but the higher level is wood, allows you to basically build it in the same way that you built the cabin itself, and it'll be fairly secure. The problem with that is a wooden chimney is not a chimney that's going to last for long. It certainly could and would catch on fire. It's just a question of when. So by building it like this, disconnected from the house and leaning away from the house, if it catches on fire, you can knock it over into the yard and save your house from burning down. We have a few primary source accounts that talk about farmers basically banking up their fire at night, checking up the chimney to see if it's lit, and then climbing up and pouring water down the top if they needed to. So this is not necessarily the safest method of construction, but for the frontier, when you don't have any neighbors close by, it's going to be, again, just enough to get by and make do until you have the time and the means to build something bigger and better. So now on the inside of our cabin, and this is a building that is serving a variety of purposes. This is storage area for our tools, sleeping area, shelter to get out of the elements, place to cook, a place to eat. So it is serving a variety of functions and certainly doesn't have the size to accommodate all of those things. This is a cabin for a family. You could expect mom, dad, and several kids to be sheltering in here in the winter, probably a little bit cramped. And as you can see, light starting to come in from a variety of sources around. This is not necessarily the most secure and well insulated place. In fact, when we're talking a little bit more about the construction, logs are not something that necessarily retain a lot of heat, nor is the daub between the walls. This is a basic wall that's going to stay pretty ice cold year round. That's nice in the summer. It might be 10 or 15 degrees cooler in here, but in the winter, probably not so much. Probably going to have a fairly large and ripping fire going in the fireplace as much as you can without catching that chimney on fire, but even so, not necessarily the most pleasant place to stay. At least comparing it to what our eastern woodland Indian neighbors up the hill have, that's probably going to be a warmer and much more comfortable structure than this is. But again, this is really just meant to be a temporary house. If this lasted you 10 years, you're probably going to be pretty happy with that. Looking at the bed in the corner, that's going to be for mom and dad or whoever's in charge of the household. Right now we have our mattress on that. That's a big linen bag stuffed with straw. Hopefully blankets and furs we could pile on top of that. But if that's for mom and dad, the kids need a place to sleep as well, and unfortunately that's probably going to be our floor, which is not the most accommodating surface. Very simple dirt floor that's been packed into place. Only benefit there, in theory, you could get fairly close to the fire during the winter. I often get questions about this area up above me. This is not a sleeping space. If you tried to sleep up there, there'd be so much smoke that you really wouldn't have a very good time. This is simply storage area. A lot of this is storage for wood. If I need to take a piece of wood to make a tool handle or something that's going to last, I'm usually going to season it first, meaning let it dry out and properly harden over the course of several months to several years. So this is really just a storage area. The other sort of funky thing we have hanging from the ceiling here is some tobacco. As I said, this area is not an area where tobacco would grow particularly well. It's not grown as a cash crop in this area in the 18th century, but it might simply be something that you're growing a little bit of, either for your own use or to trade with your neighbors as a local commodity. It's not real impressive in here, but again, this is just a shelter, so it is what it is. So speaking a little bit more broadly about agriculture, as I said, hemp was definitely the biggest cash crop here in the Valley of Virginia throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. That's not to say that was the only thing that people were growing. In fact, wheat was almost as common as a cash crop in this area. We know that a lot of the Germans were growing wheat in this area. There are some primary sources, mostly of Irish, complaining that the Germans got into this area first and took all the good, flat, lowland, close to water that was ideal for growing wheat. And that kind of makes sense. It's what they're familiar with as far as what they grew back in Germany. If you weren't growing hemp or wheat, you might still be growing a little bit of flax, but more likely you were in fact raising cattle. Cattle becomes a pretty big industry in this area throughout the 1760s and 70s. We know when the Continental Army was in Yorktown in 1781, obviously they were eating quite a bit. An army of 21,000 will eat an area dry pretty quick. So the Valley of Virginia was actually asked to send additional foodstuffs and supplies to the troops, and they sent about 500,000 pounds of cut and butchered beef and about 200,000 pounds of flour. So we can take from that that they were definitely raising quite a few head of cattle and definitely raising quite a bit of wheat as well. So, done my best to give you at least a brief look here at our 1760s site here at the museum. Not necessarily all that impressive, I'll be the first to admit. This is not really meant to either. This is just showing the start of a pretty long and difficult process as far as settling and living in this area of Virginia. The settlers, the immigrants that were coming to this part of the colony, usually coming here because they didn't have a whole lot in the way of options. Being a landowner, this was usually the best way to do that. But you're really resigning yourself to living in a pretty difficult, geographically isolated, and not necessarily safe part of the colony. And you're going to have to go through a lot of hard work and struggle to turn that forest that you got into a viable farm. And some settlers were very successful with that, and some were not. Really just depended upon who it was. But if you were successful in this area of Virginia, you could be very successful and turn this into something that your children and your grandchildren could really look towards as a source of income and more broadly as a homestead. So very happy to have you here with us. I'm glad you came and joined us today. Hope to see you soon here at the Frontier Culture Museum, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have.